Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the Path Podcast. I'm Derrick.
And I'm Jason.
And this is episode 98 of our podcast. And I get to be your host today, as Jason preached yesterday and shared with us from Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we're so thankful that Jason is not only our worship pastor, but also on our preaching team and has shared in that way.
Well, and you do a fantastic job leading worship as well.
Yes, so. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we did the switcheroo.
Yep.
So, but anyway, Jason, give us kind of a synopsis of what's happening in this passage, and then just give us that handle to hold on to this week as we walk prayerfully in humility in our own lives. So share with us about Luke 18.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is sort of in the middle of this section of there's several chapters in Luke where where Jesus is teaching, and it's mostly teaching his disciples. Like it's kind of like it's almost like the disciples have this mobile classroom that they're in with Jesus, and he's like, as they're going along, he's like, hey, here's something you can learn, or hey, let me show you this right here, or they ask him questions or whatever. So we kind of jump into the middle of Luke 18, and it's in the middle of sort of three scenes, if you will. I think we used the term vignettes last week is what we used, but these three scenes, especially in Luke 18, they all have the same structure. There's like this introductory statement, there's a parable, and then Jesus explains the parable. So you see that kind of three times in Luke 18. But specifically, we looked at this second parable where it's interesting to me that Luke steals all the thunder from Jesus' explanation, in that he says, this is what this parable's for. Then he shares the parable, and then Jesus' explanation after that. So this parable it says it's given to, in verse 9, it says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So we looked at this idea that there's an attitude of self-righteousness and pride that sneaks in. We see that in this Pharisee, and I didn't mention this yesterday, but I think we have to be careful to not lump all the Pharisees in with this Pharisee or other Pharisees that you see there. I mean, there definitely were some that acted this way, but this is not every Pharisee. I think for the most part, the Pharisees loved God. I think they were followers of God. They started with pure intentions, but it got off track somewhere. So that's a side note, free of charge. But I just thought about that. So, but yeah, so we looked at this. You have this. There's these two characters in this story. There's the Pharisee and the tax collector. You have the Pharisee, who is like, to the people who would have heard this parable, he's the image of what it means to be a moral, upstanding, just a good guy. And then you have the tax collector, which is like the image of evil for the Jews, because as we talked about, tax collectors were Jewish people who worked for the Roman Empire. And because of that, they were pretty much hated by the rest of the Jews. And throughout the Gospels, you see tax collectors lumped in with like prostitutes and thieves and liars, and they were considered the worst of the worst, because for the most part, tax collectors would collect taxes for the empire. There wasn't a whole lot of oversight from the Roman Empire, and so they really just swindled people out of money left and right and just robbed people, basically. And so, the Jews saw them as traitors, basically.
Yeah. I think there's a correlation here.
Yeah,
not
go ahead.
To interrupt you in the middle. There's a correlation of the emphasis on the Pharisee from last, or not the Pharisee, but the Samaritan from last week.
Absolutely, yeah.
And these Samaritans, tax collectors, and the others that you mentioned were seen as a pariah of society, like the bottom feeders. They're the ones that just the worst of the worst in every possible standpoint. And it's important for us to see that those are the people Jesus uses as examples of faith, humility, and the things that God is looking for, the heart of all the matter. To get beyond the whole idea that religious pursuit or a right political standing or a right standing in society, even like in a way of a kind of like a caste system.
Yeah.
That would earn you favor with God rather than not these external things, but this inward change of your own heart and this inward humility and posture before God. So.
Absolutely, yeah. I talked about it yesterday, but just the idea as I was studying, I saw I don't remember which commentary it was, but one of it called this section of Luke the section of the great reversal, in that every time you think that you know who the good guy's going to be, it ends up being the other guy, and so it's the great reversal is the way that this guy termed it, and I really liked that phrase, and so. But yeah, it's always Jesus takes what the world would see as the right answer and just flips it on its head.
Yeah.
And so that's what you see in this passage. And the way that the things that we talked about was that it's really contrasting the attitudes of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we talked about how self-righteousness blinds us to reality. So the way that we saw that in the Pharisee was that he really thought he was better than everybody else. He thought that he was sort of in a category all his own, and that's not reality. He's a sinner just like every other person. But he was blinded to reality that he had all this self-righteousness of, man, look at what all I've done. I've worked my way into this standing, and I've done all the right things. And really the thing that self-righteousness led to for the Pharisee was pride, that he has this pride in him, and it keeps him, it prevents him from actually being thankful. And we talked about how, even though he says the words, God, I thank you, he's not actually thanking God. It's the verbal tip of the hat, if you will, but he's not actually thankful. His heart was one of, he was conceited. He was smug. I mean, how demeaning! Like just talking down to everyone that's around him. Yeah. That he stands over by himself because he doesn't want to be near anyone. He doesn't want to be near the riffraff, if you will. Yeah. And so you have this attitude of just self-righteousness, smugness, ungrateful to anything that God has done, and then you have this other attitude of the tax collector who. He is standing far off. It doesn't say that he's by himself, but it says that he's far off because he understands his sinful nature. Excuse me. And he doesn't even feel like he's worthy to be in God's presence. And so because of that humility that's in his heart, he asks God, I'm a sinner, and I need you to help me with that sin. We talked about that where that how humility is the doorway to gratitude. That for the Pharisee, he would never find himself in a situation where he was feeling grateful because he's done everything himself. Why would I need to be grateful to anyone? I've done this all myself. Whereas the tax collector he's saying, God, I know my situation. I know how sinful I am. Therefore, when Jesus says that he goes home justified, he can be thankful because he knows I didn't do that on my own. God did that for me. And so just this attitude of how God gives grace and mercy to those who are humble, and he opposes those who are proud. And so we talked about this word that's typically translated in most translations where the tax collector's prayers, he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And how that word that's translated merciful is really the same word that is used to make propitiation, where propitiation is a big theological word, basically that God substitutes himself for us, where we owe this debt of sin, and Jesus puts himself in that position for us. And so the tax collector is asking, God, I need atonement for my sin. Cover me with your blood that I might be saved. And so he's taking this posture of humility and saying, I know I've messed up. I know that I have sinned, and I also know that there's nothing I can do to get rid of it. And God, I need you to come help me. And in that attitude is where we find gratitude, at the risk of sounding like I'm rhyming. But the attitude of humility is what leads to gratitude in our hearts, because it allows us to truly understand and see our situation, and truly understand and see that I think we've used this terminology before, that we contribute nothing to our salvation except for the sinfulness that makes salvation necessary. And so just that when we get that right understanding, when we're able to actually see reality for the way it is, that's when we're able to start being gracious or grateful for everything that God does in us and for us. So.
Yeah. This plea for mercy is a plea for. It's an acknowledgement of my inability, and that my only hope of mercy, my only hope of anything, is that God would give me something I don't deserve.
Yeah.
In a substitutionary way.
Right.
And that's number one. That's the gospel. Number two, it's the heart we all ought to have.
Yeah.
And I think it's important too to hear that, because I think in a lot of ways, if we look at the surrounding world and other people, and if that's our measurement, it can be easy, depending on how you're raised and those kind of things. It can be easy to say, well, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah.
And fall into the same trap that the Pharisee did, of like, thank you, God, that I'm not like this, and I haven't had these problems, and I've not been through this, and know, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, it's easy for us to fall into that. But the fact of the matter is that we are all like the tax collector. We're really all like the Pharisee too, because we're all sinners. Like, we all need God's mercy. We need God to not do what is rightfully expected to be done to us.
Yeah. Right. Well, and I think that I may be reading some of this into it, but I'm inferring from Scripture. I think Luke's point is that the problem that the Pharisee has is that's a common problem for all people.
Yeah.
We all have a natural bent towards self-righteousness. We all like to think that we're right.
Yeah.
I like to think that I'm right. I don't like to have it pointed out that I'm wrong.
No,
right?
yeah.
And so it's a common problem, and the fact that it's a common problem then makes the whole turn where the great reversal happens of the person that you would least expect to acknowledge that that's a common problem is the one who says, this is a problem that I can't deal with on my own. And I think that's where that's where the beauty lies in this parable, is that it's so simple. I mean, it's a very quick story, but you have such a stark contrast between self-righteousness, self-reliance. I mean, we talked about yesterday that in that 2-sentence prayer, the Pharisee uses the word I 5 times. It's all about himself.
Yeah.
And that is our natural bent. If not for the grace of God to remind us, hey, this is who you are. And I think, at the risk of sounding redundant, because I've said this before, but all of our problems in life come from too high a view of ourselves and too low a view of God. And when we can get to that point where we humble ourselves and rightly understand our position in relation to who God is, that's when humility comes, and that's when gratitude comes too, because you're able to rightly see the situation for what it is and not be blinded by self-righteousness.
Yeah. I think, a bit of a theme in these 2 weeks, the 10 lepers are in a similar situation, right? Yeah. They know they're at the rope's end, and they're dangling by a thread, right? They know. There's no question. Society had set that up for them to see very clearly, so they could very clearly acknowledge, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.
Yeah,
He's the only one that can do it.
Yeah.
This tax collector, through social means, I would imagine, is in that place. Even though it's this great reversal, he's in that place of being at the very end of himself.
Yeah,
and we don't have to wait. Like me personally, I don't have to wait to for society to put me in that place, or for even God's through His sovereignty to take me to that moment of understanding I'm at the end of myself, I can posture myself before God, acknowledging these truths, in the posture of humility, emptying of myself. I can say, God, I know I can't do this on my own.
Yeah.
And I know that you can do it. And so God, have mercy on me as well. And we have to put ourselves in a headspace in that way, like the word posture. We have to place ourselves in that posture first, because if we don't, we'll have the posture of pride instead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I didn't think about this till just now, but in both of those stories, and I think we'll see more of this next week too when we move on to the end of 18. In both of those situations, the people who are being affected are going through the channels that God had already prescribed. So the lepers, there was a process for go present yourself to the priest. If you're clean, he deems you clean. If not, you go and you come back. There's a process here, like the process has been set up at the temple, that if you need to pray, you go in at a certain time and you pray and you ask God for mercy or whatever. And it's in those really mundane, quote unquote normal ways of interacting with God that God does something miraculous. And that's really cool.
It is, yeah. For us, it's our Sunday morning gathering.
Absolutely.
It's our small group times. It's our daily quiet time, our daily devotional, thoughts with the Lord. And, and sometimes they're just the same thing over and over and again. But sometimes, there's this inkling of oh my goodness, I have no business being here.
Right.
It's like.
I have no business being here, but I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go.
But I'm glad I'm here.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's this weird sort of paradox of things of, I feel like I have no business being here, but I know this is where I have to come in order for this to get helped.
And 10 guys were placed in the same exact situation. Only one came back grateful.
Right. In
this story, 2 people are in the exact same place of prayer. Right? Yeah. But one comes away justified. The other goes on in his own self righteousness and self-justification. So, it's not always guaranteed that in that mundane purposing, our relationship with the Lord, that we will walk away as we need to. So we've got to find that way of understanding who He is and who we are properly, so that we can respond properly, so that God speaks to us properly as well and helps us to see our need in those moments.
Absolutely. So. I think it's another good reminder too of that. We have to keep coming to God even when we don't feel like coming to God. Because I'm sure that the tax collector didn't get up that morning and was like, well, let's go down to the temple. I feel great. Let's walk down to the temple this morning. I'm sure he didn't feel that way. And yet he went because he knew, I don't want to be here, but I know this is where I need to be. And I think that's a really good reminder for us that how is it that's described, a long obedience in the same direction, that even when we don't feel like continuing to do the things that God has called us to do, that's when we most need to be doing the things that God has called us to do.
I agree.
And it's not always about feelings, because you're not always going to feel like doing what you want to do. I mean, I feel like this is a safe place to admit this, that there are Sunday mornings when that alarm goes off and I'm like, I don't want to do this today. And yet I get up and do it because I know that, number one, God's called me to do it. And number two, He's going to be most glorified when I'm doing things that not in my own strength, but relying on Him to get me through it. So,
that's good. That's great. Well, we want to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about, this idea of self-righteousness and how pervasive that is in all of our own hearts if we're not careful, but also this posture of humility and how that has affected you. This and maybe what ways you make sure your heart is in that posture of humility as well. Of have mercy on me, Lord. We'd love to hear that. Share with us through our email, thepath@lafayette1st.life. We'd love to hear from you and dialogue with you in that way. Until then, I'm Derrick.
And I'm Jason.
And we'll see you next time as we continue down the path.